The Night Guardian. The crimson sky of twilight cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Oakbrook, a peaceful suburb of Chicago. The tranquility felt almost suffocating, as if something was about to happen. From the shadows of a dusty alley, a staggering figure emerged. Rusty, an old golden retriever with a graying snout and deep eyes that seemed to carry secrets, walked with the weight of years. He had once been the center of someone's world, a faithful companion until the day his owner, a lonely widow, passed away. Since then, Rusty had wandered the streets, a free spirit with a wounded heart. As he crossed the corner of Elm Street, Rusty stopped at Mrs. Abney's porch, the gentle widow who always left water and food in a bowl for him. But tonight, the air felt denser. He sensed something different, something that prodded his instincts. It was in the park where everything changed. Rusty heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks. It wasn't a bark or the sound of a trapped bird. It was a cry. Weak, almost imperceptible, but filled with desperation. His ears twitched, his whole body went on alert, and he followed the sound, crossing through bushes and trash cans gleaming under the cold light of a street lamp. When he reached the source of the sound, Rusty froze. Inside a trash can, among crumpled newspapers and leftover food, was something he never expected, a baby. The child was curled up, skin pale from the cold, the crying almost fading like a candle nearing its end. Rusty, who barely had the strength to carry himself, knew in that instant that he couldn't leave the baby there. With a delicacy that contrasted with his size, he bit the edge of the blanket wrapped around the baby and lifted it, feeling the tiny body shiver against his fur. With his heart racing, Rusty left the park. He needed to find help, but where? Time seemed to be working against him, and the weight of responsibility made his tired paws almost give out. Then, a flash of memory crossed his mind. The blue house on Sycamore Street. Margaret. The retired nurse who always took in injured birds and stray cats. She would know what to do. Rusty quickened his pace, panting. People still walking the streets looked on, surprised, trying to understand why this old dog was carrying a baby. A young man nearly fell off his bike when they passed by, but Rusty couldn't stop. When he finally reached Margaret's house, the porch light was on. He climbed the steps with effort, laid the baby on the mat, and began to bark, loudly, urgently, as if his soul was being projected in every sound. Margaret opened the door and froze. First, she saw Rusty, a dog she knew by sight. But when her gaze shifted to what he brought, her eyes widened. My God! She didn't hesitate. She carefully took the baby, feeling how alarmingly cold she was. As she worked quickly to warm the child, her instincts as a nurse took over. In minutes, she was calling for an ambulance, detailing the situation. But as Margaret tended to the baby, something began to bother her. The scene felt surreal. Who could abandon a child? And why? When the paramedics arrived, more questions emerged. The baby was dehydrated, but Margaret noticed something more, a slight tremor indicating a bigger problem. The hospital doctor confirmed it. The child had a rare condition, and every minute was crucial. While Rusty observed everything from the corner of the room, his tired eyes watching, Margaret felt that this was only the beginning. There was more to this story. Someone somewhere had answers, and secrets. And that night, as the city lights slowly dimmed, a shadow in the back of the park moved. Someone had seen everything. Someone knew that Rusty had found the baby. But what Rusty and Margaret couldn't imagine was that the baby was the key to something much bigger than they could comprehend. And in the shadows, a danger was approaching. As Dr. Reeves adjusted the monitoring screens, Margaret couldn't tear her eyes away from baby Hope, now connected to a series of machines, her fragile heartbeat pulsing irregularly. Margaret, we need to talk about the baby, Dr. Reeves began, his voice deep, as though preparing for something difficult. Hope's condition is more complicated than we initially thought. Margaret furrowed her brow, her stomach tightening. She had already suspected as much, but hearing it from a doctor like Reeves was something else entirely. In the neonatal ICU, the doctor projected the latest test results on a screen. Her condition is called tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. It's a complex congenital heart defect that will require specialized surgery. Margaret took a deep breath, the gravity of the situation pressing on her chest. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but the confirmation that Hope's life was in their hands made everything feel even more real. What are the chances? Margaret asked, her voice tight. Dr. Reeves ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that revealed his own anxiety. It's risky, especially for such a small newborn. but it's our only option. As the doctor explained the details of the procedure, Margaret grew increasingly tense. She was in the midst of a nightmare where every second could mean the difference between life and death. Suddenly, the door opened, and a nurse quickly entered, interrupting the conversation. "Dr. Reeves, Miss Thorne, there's a couple in the waiting room who claim to be Hope's parents." The two exchanged a quick glance, and Margaret felt a wave of relief and concern. Had they finally found the baby's parents? She wasn't sure if this was good news or not. With Rusty trotting behind them, Margaret and Dr. Reeves made their way to the waiting room. There, they found Detective Chun already speaking with a nervous young couple. "Miss Thorne, Dr. Reeves, these are Mr. and Mrs. Ellison," the detective said, his gaze observant and suspicious. "They claim to be Hope's parents." The woman, tears in her eyes, stepped forward. "Is she okay?" "Our daughter." Margaret felt a mix of relief, but something else, an uneasy discomfort. There was something off about them. Something didn't seem right. The detective began questioning the couple about the abandonment of Hope. As the questions were asked, their answers sounded rehearsed, lacking the anguish Margaret would expect from parents who had left their child alone. It was then that Rusty, who had been silent until now, let out a low growl. His eyes fixed intently on the couple. The man jumped back, startled. "Keep that dog away from us." Margaret and Dr. Reeves exchanged glances. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "What's going on here?" the detective asked, his voice stern. As he continued to question the couple, the inconsistencies became more apparent. Finally, under the pressure of the investigation, the woman couldn't hold it in anymore. Okay. We're not her parents. We heard about the reward and thought that if we found her, we could, she sobbed. Detective Chun cut her off firmly. "You're being arrested for fraud and obstruction of justice." As the couple was led away by the police, Margaret felt a mix of disappointment and relief. It was strange how things could turn so quickly. She looked at Rusty, who was gradually relaxing, and patted him. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his ears. "You knew, didn't you?" "I can't believe someone would try to take advantage of a situation like this," Dr. Reeves said, still bewildered. "Sometimes people surprise us, for better or worse," Margaret replied, sadness in her eyes. As they turned to head back to the neonatal ICU, Dr. Reeves' pager vibrated. He glanced at the message, his expression going pale. "It's Hope," he said, his voice tense. "Her condition is deteriorating. We need to operate now." The urgency in the room was palpable, and Margaret felt a cold panic spreading through her veins. They had come so far, but there was still so much to lose. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Hold on, little one. We can't lose you now." In the operating room, time seemed to stop. Hours dragged on, and Margaret's only solace was having Rusty by her side, as quiet as ever, his eyes fixed on the surgery room door. When finally, in the late afternoon, Dr. Reeves emerged, his face marked by exhaustion but his soul visibly relieved, Margaret could hardly breathe. "Liam," she whispered. The doctor looked at her, and for a moment, her heart stopped. But then, slowly, a relieved smile spread across his face. "She made it," he said with a sigh of relief. "It was close, but she's a fighter." Joy flooded through Margaret like a wave, but before she could react fully, Dr. Reeves added in a serious tone, "There's more." Detective Chun found the mother. And just as if the plot had taken a new turn, the detective appeared at the door with a young woman, pale and trembling. She was Zoe Matthews, and her eyes were filled with despair. Zoe looked at Margaret, her voice breaking. "My baby. Is she okay?" Margaret stood up and looked at her with compassion. "Your daughter is strong. She's going to be okay, dear. Just like you." Zoe collapsed into tears as Margaret guided her to a chair. And there, with the weight of the story about to be revealed, Zoe began to speak. I was an idiot," she said through sobs. "I was an exemplary student. I wanted to be a doctor. But one night, a party, a mistake, and then the pregnancy. I didn't know what to do." Zoe's eyes were filled with guilt, but also real anguish. She explained how, afraid of being rejected by her parents and losing her future, she had left the baby in the park, thinking someone would quickly find her. "I was so scared," Zoe said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought she'd be found. But when I got home, I realized the gravity of what I'd done. I hid, trying to gather the courage to do the right thing." Detective Chun, who had been listening in silence, interjected. Zoe turned herself in this afternoon. Given the situation and her cooperation, we're working with the prosecutor's office to ensure she's treated justly. Dr. Reeves looked at Zoe seriously. Your daughter has a rare condition called tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. She'll need ongoing treatment. Zoe looked at the nurse, fear creeping into her gaze, but Margaret held her hands firmly. Your daughter is a warrior, Zoe. And so are you.